It is projected that most of Grand Bahama, including Nassau, Abaco, and Spanish Wells in the Caribbean, will be underwater by 2050 due to climate change. Several islands and surrounding countries in the Caribbean, where various people of African descent have lived with deep connections to their land and the sea, are threatened. It's no longer news that Haiti has long been ravaged by severe storms, floods, and droughts, which have claimed lives, destroyed buildings, land, water sources, and livestock. In Africa in 2022, unprecedented deadly floods killed hundreds of Nigerians and left well over 1 million homeless. Again, close to 2 million people in Chad were also affected by floods. Devastating droughts continue to kill people in Somalia, Uganda, Ethiopia, to mention just a few. In the southern African areas, countries like Madagascar and Mozambique were battered by severe storms, killing close to 1,000 people. In 2022 alone, extreme weather events have killed at least 4,000 people and affected a further 19 million Africans. So, should we be fooled by the so-called wins at COP27? Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee. Subscribe if you've not yet done so. And don't forget to turn on your notification buttons. And so you know when we have new episodes. Of course, share our videos with all your contacts. And then don't forget to check out our new website, sankofastorybooks.com, for history, Afrocentric stories, and other resources for our children. Unfortunately, the numbers that I quoted in my intro may even be way too low to paint a clear picture of how climate change affects global Africa, because a lot of these events are not properly reported. On the other hand, the US hurricane season and the heat wave in Europe have captured headlines, while most extreme and deadly weather events in the Caribbean and Africa have gone largely unreported in global North media. So, who or what is really responsible for climate change? Well, while the developed world and most of their climate activists will answer this glibly by saying that human activities are responsible for almost all of the increase in greenhouse gases and so on, this attempt to make the cause of climate change a collective responsibility is most deceptive. We know that the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation. So all we need to do is to look back at exactly where the greatest carbon emissions have come from historically. Carbon lingers in the atmosphere for centuries. The CO2 pumped out of places like North America and Europe. As a matter of fact, the entire economic north, including places like Australia and so on, as well as Russia in the 1950s, is doing just as much damage as the CO2 being pumped out of China today. Given the long-term scale of Western development, they are responsible for the climatic mess the world is currently in. This is another reason why we should challenge their race to exploit space. Because after destroying the climate here on Earth to make their countries rich, they are now competing to dominate space. Who is trying to figure out what the cost of their exploits in space will mean for future generations of our children? And if the patterns of attempt to dominate space follows what history tells us, countries in the economic north who are now expending so much to dominate space will get there, take as much advantage of it as they can to feed their insatiable desire for wealth, make huge profits while destroying space. And then they will start screaming about the effects of the harm that their exploitation of it has caused. They will then start stopping others from going there while claiming that we're all responsible for the damage. If this scenario sounds familiar to you, it is because it's the same song that has been playing regarding the damage done to the earth after the global north has been so irresponsible about exploiting just about every resource to build their economies. But that is perhaps a topic for another day. The way in which even something as serious as climate change is often exploited through greenwashing or greensheen is not within the scope of this episode. So, what can African, Caribbean countries and other developing parts of the world do to stop the horrible effects of climate change that we're suffering from right now? The devastating damages that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode are just a tip of the climatic woes to come. Some studies predict that the annual damages in the developing world will average somewhere between 1.1 and 1.8 trillion dollars if nothing is done to stop it. As such, we must insist on making the developed world pay for the damage that they have continued to cause. Nothing is more unfair than the way the developed world keeps trying to push the idea that the whole world must share in the cost of reversing the damages that they have caused and continue to cause. Is it not only reasonable to insist that the countries that are responsible for climate change pay for loss and damage that they have caused? In dollar terms, civil society groups propose that the US alone owes and should pay at least $800 billion in international climate finance by 2030. They propose that the amount should be equally split to cover finance for mitigation, adaptation, and the loss and damage caused by irreversible climate change, so that the communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, like some of the ones I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, can rebuild and recover after disasters. So, why are the developed world refusing to commit fully to loss and damage as being proposed by the developing world? Well, the reason is quite simple. The developed countries are resistant to any measure that could potentially open them up to legal claims for compensation or legal causes tied to their long-term climate pollution. As a matter of fact, America's spokesperson at the last at the COP27, John Kerry, did not mince words about this when he said it was a well-known fact that the US and many other countries will not establish some sort of legal structure that is tied to compensation or liability. He emphasized that that's just not happening. This is why, rather than commit fully to the loss and damage proposed by the Global South at the COP27 Climate Summit, the Global North countries only agreed to set up a fund to help poor countries which are being battered by climate disasters, but have delayed approving the outlining global resolve to actually fight climate change. So it's all politics, you know. They're playing politics with the earth, with our lives, with our countries. The entire summit, of course, has been marked by all kinds of delay tactics and distractions by the developed countries, just as they've been doing in the past. One example of such distractions was their proposed global shield, their proposal to set up a global shield. This so-called global shield, which was put forward by countries like the US, is simply a system which allows them to decide when to give small bits of money as if they are doing the countries suffering from climate change a favor, rather than paying for what they owe, for the damage they are doing to them. The money they would give would also be in form of tailor-made insurance packages. And we all know that 9 out of 10 times, insurance companies have perfected the art of finding reasons why they will not pay for losses covered. Insurance companies are also most likely going to be unwilling to cover countries in the case of the most extreme events. The irony, though, in the position of the developed countries and their reluctance to accept the demands for loss and damage is that they have clearly set precedents for it when there are environmental disasters within their countries. When there's an oil spillage, they apply loss and damage. Thankfully, on the 22nd of September 2022, the United Nations Human Rights Commission found that the Australian government is violating its human rights obligations to Torres Strait Islanders by failing to act on climate change. Other countries in the economic south should take note of this development and then just use it more forcefully. It's a question of human rights. It's not a question of them doing us a favor. So developed countries are responsible for the greatest historical damage to the climate. So for the damage that they have done to be reversed, rich countries need to cut their emissions by close to 200%. A situation which is actually impossible. As such, if climate activists from the developed world are sincere, they should know that all this their noise about protecting the environment, wildlife, and so on is just hypocritical unless they mount pressure on their leaders to do the right thing in the developing world. Climate activists in Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the developing world are right in saying that climate change is a collective problem. But we need to stop this falsehood that it is a collective responsibility. There are two different things. The fact that it's a collective problem does not make it a collective responsibility. The responsibility is collective only to the extent that we must insist on something being done about it. However, the price for fixing the earth must come from the rich countries. Developing countries are already making enough sacrifice, whether or not they know it, or whether or not their sacrifices are imposed by poverty. They consume way less, of fossil fuel, their carbon footprints are infinitesimal compared to the rich countries. We cannot be begging the rich countries to let us live. We must demand the right to live. Climate change is a matter of life and death for us already. It's not a thing of the future. The natural disasters that we're already facing prove this. Thanks for watching. Please support us through Patreon and by buying me coffee so we can continue to bring you this series. Subscribe if you've not yet done so. Turn on your notification buttons. And don't forget to share our videos with all your contacts and keep those comments coming. And also remember to check out our new website, sankofastorybooks.com, for history, Afrocentric stories, and other resources for our children.